The wind moves slowly across the quiet fields of Hamilton. Today there is almost nothing here. No towering columns. No glittering chandeliers. No echo of aristocratic laughter drifting through endless halls. Just grass and silence. Yet 2 centuries ago this land held something so vast, so extravagant, that many believed it rivaled the palaces of kings. A residence so magnificent that visitors struggled to comprehend its scale. A palace built not for royalty, but for one of the richest aristocratic families in Britain. This was Hamilton Palace. A monument to ambition. A symbol of immense old money. And ultimately, a cautionary tale about power, arrogance, and spectacular collapse. Because despite its staggering grandeur, Hamilton Palace did not survive. And its destruction remains one of the most astonishing downfalls in British aristocratic history. But to understand how something so magnificent could disappear almost entirely, we must return to the beginning. To a dynasty whose wealth seemed limitless. A family whose ambition knew no restraint. The House of Hamilton. The dynasty behind the palace. In the hierarchy of British aristocracy, few names carried as much prestige as the Hamiltons. For centuries the family held immense power across Scotland. At the center of that dynasty stood the title of Duke of Hamilton, one of the most senior and respected noble ranks in the United Kingdom. The Hamilton lineage stretched deep into Scottish history, intertwined with politics, military command, and royal alliances. They were not simply wealthy. They were a force within the social architecture of Britain itself. By the late 18th century, the Hamilton estate in Hamilton, Scotland had already existed for generations. But the residence that stood there was modest compared to what would come next. Because one particular duke believed something extraordinary. Something dangerous. He believed the Hamilton name deserved a palace that would surpass them all. The vision of unmatched grandeur. The man behind this dream was Alexander Hamilton. Ambitious, cultured, and deeply obsessed with legacy. During the late 1700s and early 1800s, European aristocrats were competing not just through politics or influence, but through architecture. Palaces had become symbols of supremacy. The larger the residence, the louder the message. And Alexander Hamilton wanted the loudest message of all. He envisioned a residence so enormous that visitors would struggle to take it in. A palace that would dominate the Scottish landscape. A structure that would quietly announce to the world. The Hamilton dynasty was untouchable. Construction began on what would soon become the largest private residence in Britain. Hamilton Palace. The architectural masterpiece. Even by aristocratic standards, the palace was staggering. The central facade stretched more than 260 feet across. Massive Corinthian columns rose toward the sky, giving the building the appearance of a Roman temple reborn in stone. Visitors approaching the palace often described the same experience. First came the distant silhouette, then the realization of scale, and finally, the overwhelming sensation of standing before something built not simply for comfort, but for domination. The palace overlooked immense parklands, gardens, and carefully manicured landscapes. Carriages rolled through enormous gates. Servants moved silently along gravel paths. Inside, the extravagance only intensified. Grand halls stretched endlessly. Marble staircases curved upward beneath elaborate ceilings. And chandeliers illuminated rooms filled with some of the most valuable art collections in Britain. Hamilton Palace was not merely a home. It was a statement. A declaration of aristocratic confidence. Perhaps even arrogance. The most luxurious interior in Britain. If the exterior was intimidating, the interior was breathtaking. One particular room became legendary among visitors. The Long Gallery. Stretching nearly 120 feet, the gallery housed paintings collected across Europe. Masterpieces acquired from Italy, France, and Spain lined the walls. Portraits of Hamilton ancestors watched silently from golden frames. Some guests claimed walking through the gallery felt less like visiting a home, and more like stepping into a royal museum. Then there were the private chambers. Bedrooms adorned with silk fabrics. Carved fireplaces imported from continental Europe. Ceilings decorated with intricate plasterwork. Every detail whispered the same message. Money was no object, and the Hamilton family intended to prove it. Lavish gatherings of the elite. The palace soon became the center of aristocratic social life. Lavish gatherings were hosted within its vast halls. Diplomats, politicians, and noble families traveled from across Britain to attend these events. Carriages lined the approach roads late into the night. Music echoed through the ballroom. Candles flickered across polished marble. And the Hamilton name became synonymous with extravagance, The palace symbolized the height of British aristocratic power during the early 19th century. But beneath the glittering chandeliers, something else was slowly taking shape. Something invisible. Something dangerous. The cost of maintaining such a palace was enormous. Almost incomprehensible. And the deeper the Hamilton family leaned into this life of extravagance, the more fragile their empire quietly became. The hidden cracks beneath the marble. To maintain Hamilton Palace required vast resources. Hundreds of servants. Endless repairs. Imported materials. And constant displays of luxury expected from a family of such prestige. At first it seemed effortless. The Hamilton estates generated massive income from land and industry, coal mines, agriculture, and rents from thousands of tenants across Scotland. The money flowed steadily. But wealth on that scale creates its own illusions. Because maintaining a palace of this magnitude meant the expenses never stopped, never slowed, and never forgave mistakes. What few realized at the time was this. The palace itself had become a kind of financial trap. A magnificent structure that demanded more and more resources with each passing year. A monument that could elevate a family, or quietly destroy it. The next generation. As decades passed, Hamilton Palace continued to evolve. Each new duke added something grander. New art collections, new furnishings, new renovations. And with every addition, the palace grew even more legendary. But one particular figure would soon take the Hamilton name to unprecedented heights. A man whose obsession with luxury would become almost mythical. A duke who transformed Hamilton Palace into something closer to a European royal residence. His name was William Hamilton. And his reign would mark the absolute peak of the palace's power. Yet his story would also begin the slow unraveling of the Hamilton Empire. Because the same ambition that built Hamilton Palace would eventually push it toward catastrophe. The palace at its peak. By the mid-1800s, Hamilton Palace had become one of the most talked about private residences in Europe. Visitors compared it to royal palaces. Travel writers described it as a symbol of Britain's aristocratic supremacy. Even rival noble families quietly acknowledged its dominance. The Hamilton collection of art and artifacts had grown astonishingly valuable. Paintings from the Renaissance, rare furniture, ancient sculptures, priceless manuscripts. Inside the palace walls sat one of the most extraordinary private collections ever assembled in Britain. But maintaining this level of prestige required constant expansion. More acquisitions, more renovations, more spending. And the Hamilton family had begun to develop a reputation for something else as well. Extravagance without limits. A kind of aristocratic confidence that bordered on recklessness. And history has a way of punishing that kind of confidence. The first signs of trouble. At first, the warning signs were subtle. A delayed payment here. An expensive renovation there. Then a few quiet financial adjustments behind the scenes. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would alarm the outside world. After all, this was the Hamilton dynasty. A family whose wealth appeared endless. Yet deep inside the palace walls, decisions were being made that would alter the future forever. Because maintaining Hamilton Palace was no longer just expensive. It was becoming unsustainable. So, events far beyond the control of the Hamilton family would begin reshaping Britain itself. Industrial change, economic shifts, and pressures that aristocratic dynasties were not prepared to face. The palace that once symbolized unlimited wealth was slowly becoming a burden too large to carry. But the Hamilton family refused to see it. And their next decisions would push the palace toward a fate no one could have imagined. A fate that would ultimately erase one of Britain's greatest mansions from the map. The chandeliers of Hamilton Palace burned late into the night. Outside, the Scottish wind swept across the vast lawns of Hamilton, rustling through the trees that framed the colossal palace. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but quiet. Music floated through towering halls. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Servants moved silently between rooms carrying silver trays. And at the center of it all stood a man whose ambition and spending would soon become legendary across Britain. William Hamilton. If his predecessor had built Hamilton Palace into a symbol of aristocratic prestige, William Hamilton intended to transform it into something even greater. A palace that rivaled the courts of European kings. But the path he chose would slowly turn magnificence into excess. And excess into danger. A duke obsessed with grandeur. William Hamilton inherited the title of Duke of Hamilton during a period when aristocratic reputation depended heavily on spectacle. To be powerful in 19th century Britain was not enough. One had to appear powerful. Palaces became stages. Art collections became trophies. And wealth had to be displayed in ways that left no room for doubt. For William Hamilton, this competition became something of a personal mission. He was intelligent, cultured, and deeply fascinated by European art and antiquities. But he also possessed a trait that would prove dangerously expensive. He believed beauty and prestige were worth any cost. And Hamilton Palace would become the canvas for that belief. Europe's treasure hunter. Unlike many aristocrats who simply inherited their collections, William Hamilton actively searched for treasures. He traveled across Europe acquiring rare works of art. Italy, France, Spain. Every journey ended with crates of priceless objects being shipped back to Scotland. Soon, the galleries of Hamilton Palace began filling with masterpieces. Visitors would later describe the palace as having one of the most astonishing private collections in the British Isles. Among the prized possessions were paintings attributed to legendary artists, rare sculptures from ancient civilizations, ornate furniture crafted centuries earlier for royal households. The long gallery, already magnificent, became even more breathtaking. Golden frames lined the walls like an endless procession of history. Visitors walked slowly, almost reverently, as if inside a sacred temple of art. But every masterpiece came with a price, and the bills were growing larger each year. A palace turned museum. Hamilton Palace was no longer simply a residence. It had quietly evolved into something far grander. An aristocratic museum. Guests arriving at the palace often felt overwhelmed by the sheer scale of luxury. Servants guided them through corridors lined with marble statues. Grand staircases curved upward toward towering ceilings decorated with intricate plasterwork. Every room seemed to reveal another astonishing artifact. Rare clocks from France. Silk tapestries woven in Italy. Antique cabinets carved from exotic woods. And at the center of it all was the Duke himself. A quiet but intensely proud collector. He loved showing visitors the treasures he had gathered. Each object had a story. Each artifact symbolized his reach across Europe's cultural elite. The message was unmistakable. Hamilton Palace was no ordinary aristocratic home. It was one of the most refined private collections in the world. The legendary dining hall. But art was only one part of William Hamilton's vision. He also believed Hamilton Palace should host the most unforgettable gatherings in Britain. The dining hall alone was a spectacle. An enormous room illuminated by towering chandeliers. A polished table stretching across the hall like a gleaming river of silver and crystal. When the Duke entertained guests, the dinners could last for hours. Course after course appeared. Fine wines from continental vineyards flowed freely. The guests themselves were some of the most powerful figures in British society. Politicians, military leaders, aristocrats whose family history stretched back centuries. These gatherings became famous. Stories spread across Britain of the incredible luxury found within Hamilton Palace. But while guests admired the spectacle, few truly understood how much it cost to maintain. A lifestyle without limits. William Hamilton's spending habits slowly became the subject of quiet whispers. Even among aristocrats, who were no strangers to extravagance, his lifestyle stood apart. New purchases arrived constantly. Rare artworks, exotic furniture, imported materials for endless renovations. Every improvement made the palace more magnificent, but also more expensive to maintain. Servants alone numbered in the hundreds. Each wing of the palace required constant care. Heating enormous halls during cold Scottish winters demanded massive resources. And maintaining the priceless art collection required careful preservation. The palace had become an enormous financial machine. One that consumed wealth at an astonishing rate. But the Hamilton family still believed their fortune was limitless. And that belief would soon be tested. The illusion of endless wealth. For generations, the Hamilton estate had relied heavily on land income. Across Scotland, vast territories paid rent to the Hamilton family. Coal mines produced industrial wealth. Agricultural estates generated steady profits. For a long time, this system seemed indestructible. But the 19th century was a time of dramatic economic transformation. Industry was reshaping Britain. Urban growth changed patterns of wealth. And land-based aristocratic fortunes were beginning to face pressures they had never encountered before. Yet inside Hamilton Palace, life continued as though nothing could change. Lavish parties continued. Art acquisitions expanded. The palace remained a symbol of supreme aristocratic confidence. But quietly, outside the palace walls, the foundations of that wealth were beginning to shift. The underground threat. The threat came from an unexpected place. Coal. Beneath the Hamilton estate lay vast coal deposits. Mining companies had been extracting these resources for years. At first, the profits seemed beneficial. Coal fueled Britain's industrial revolution, and the Hamilton family received substantial income from mining operations. But there was a hidden cost. Coal extraction gradually destabilized the land beneath parts of the estate. The ground slowly shifted. Tiny structural changes began appearing within Hamilton Palace itself. Cracks in walls. Subtle vibrations. At first, these issues seemed minor. Repairs were made. Architects reassured the family. But the problem was deeper than anyone realized. And the palace, despite its massive stone structure, was not immune to the effects. What was happening beneath the ground would eventually threaten the very survival of the palace itself. The weight of prestige. By the late 1800s, Hamilton Palace stood at the absolute height of aristocratic magnificence. Its art collection rivaled royal holdings. Its gatherings attracted Britain's elite. Its architecture remained one of the most imposing sights in Scotland. But prestige carries its own pressure. The Hamilton family could not simply scale back their lifestyle. Doing so would signal weakness. And in aristocratic society, reputation was everything. So the spending continued. More acquisitions. More improvements. More dazzling displays of wealth. The palace became larger than life. A symbol of unstoppable aristocratic power. But symbols like that can become dangerous. Because when expectations grow too large, reality eventually pushes back. The first shadow over the palace. As the 19th century drew toward its end, subtle changes began appearing in Britain's social order. Industrial magnates were rising in influence. Old aristocratic families faced increasing financial pressure, and maintaining enormous estates was becoming more difficult than ever. For Hamilton Palace, the warning signs were already present. Mining activity continued beneath nearby land. Maintenance costs climbed higher every year, and the palace itself required constant attention. Yet the Hamilton dynasty still believed their legacy was secure. After all, this palace had stood for generations. Its halls had witnessed the most powerful figures in Britain. Surely something so magnificent could never fall. But history has a habit of proving such confidence wrong. Because within just a few decades, the palace that symbolized aristocratic triumph would begin an extraordinary descent. A descent marked by financial strain, structural danger, and decisions that would shock the British public. And soon, the unimaginable question would arise. Could the greatest private palace in Britain actually disappear? For decades, the immense silhouette of Hamilton Palace dominated the Scottish landscape like a monument to aristocratic confidence. Its vast columns stood against the grey skies of Hamilton. Visitors approaching the estate often slowed their carriages in disbelief. The scale of the palace was overwhelming. The massive stone facade. The endless rows of windows. The towering Corinthian columns that seemed almost too large for a private residence. Everything about Hamilton Palace communicated the same message. The Hamilton dynasty was powerful, unshakable, permanent. But history has a way of challenging permanence. And by the final years of the 19th century, subtle warning signs were beginning to appear. Signs that the foundations of this extraordinary palace were not as secure as they seemed. At first, almost no one noticed. The silent movement beneath the estate. The problem did not begin inside the palace. It began far below it. Beneath the vast Hamilton estate lay rich coal deposits that had fueled Britain's growing industrial economy for decades. Mining operations expanded steadily throughout the region. Companies extracted coal to power factories, railways, and cities across the United Kingdom. For the Hamilton family, these mines had long been a source of wealth. The estate earned significant revenue from industrial activity. On paper, it looked like a perfect arrangement. Coal fueled Britain's prosperity, and the Hamilton dynasty benefited from the profits. But beneath the surface, something far less stable was taking shape. Mining slowly removed vast sections of underground support. Large empty cavities formed deep below the land surrounding the palace. And over time, the ground above those spaces began to shift. At first, the movement was microscopic, barely measurable. But stone, no matter how magnificent, does not easily forgive movement. Even the smallest shift can have consequences. And Hamilton Palace was built on a scale that magnified every structural stress. The first signs of disturbance. The earliest signs appeared quietly. A servant noticed a hairline crack in one of the palace corridors. An architect observed subtle changes in the alignment of certain walls. Doors that once closed perfectly began sticking slightly within their frames. These were not dramatic events. Nothing collapsed. Nothing visibly threatened the palace's grandeur. Most people assumed the changes were simply the natural aging of a massive structure. After all, Hamilton Palace had stood for generations. Minor repairs were routine. Stonework was inspected. Plasterwork was refreshed. But as the years passed, the signs became harder to ignore. Cracks widened. Floors developed subtle slopes. And in certain rooms, faint vibrations could sometimes be felt. It was as if the earth itself were slowly shifting beneath the palace. Architects began to worry. Eventually, engineers were called to inspect the structure. Their reports were cautious but unsettling. They believed underground mining activity had begun affecting the stability of the estate. The ground beneath certain areas was no longer perfectly solid. Tiny shifts were occurring over time. And for a building as enormous as Hamilton Palace, even small movements could create serious long-term risks. Reinforcement measures were recommended. Repairs could help. But they came with a warning. If mining continued nearby, the palace might experience increasing structural stress. The Hamilton family listened. They acknowledged the advice. But halting mining operations would mean reducing a major source of income. And at that moment, the palace required enormous funds simply to operate. So the warnings were treated as manageable concerns. Repairs continued. Reinforcements were added. Life inside the palace carried on. But the cracks remained. The cost of maintaining magnificence. At the same time, another problem was quietly growing. The cost of maintaining Hamilton Palace had reached astonishing levels. The building itself required constant attention. Massive halls had to be heated during harsh Scottish winters. Roofs, windows, and stonework demanded regular repair. The art collection, one of the most valuable private collections in Britain, required careful preservation. Servants still numbered in the hundreds. Gardens stretched across vast sections of the estate. And every aspect of aristocratic life required significant expense. For generations, these costs had been supported by the enormous wealth of the Hamilton estates. But the economic landscape of Britain was changing. Agricultural profits fluctuated. Industrial markets experienced unpredictable shifts. And maintaining vast aristocratic properties was becoming increasingly difficult for many noble families. Hamilton Palace was not just large. It was colossal. And colossal things are expensive to keep alive. A changing Britain. The late 19th century marked a turning point for the British aristocracy. Industrial entrepreneurs were rising to prominence. New wealth emerged from factories, railways, and global trade. Meanwhile, many traditional landowning families began experiencing financial pressure. The old economic model, based on land rents and agricultural income, no longer guaranteed stability. Taxes increased. Estate maintenance costs soared. And public attitudes toward aristocratic extravagance began shifting. Lavish displays of wealth that once impressed society were now sometimes viewed with quiet skepticism. Hamilton Palace still represented prestige. But it also symbolized a kind of old-world luxury that was becoming harder to justify. Yet inside the palace walls, little seemed to change. The Hamilton family continued living with the grandeur expected of their title. Dinners were still held beneath glittering chandeliers. Guests still wandered through galleries filled with priceless art. The palace still projected an image of absolute confidence. But behind the scenes, financial strain was slowly building. And the palace itself was becoming increasingly fragile. The shadow of structural damage. As mining continued beneath the surrounding region, the palace experienced additional structural changes. Engineers began noticing measurable shifts in certain sections of the building. Columns required reinforcement. Walls required careful restoration. Stone blocks weighing several tons needed repositioning. These repairs were incredibly expensive. And they were only temporary solutions. Because the deeper issue remained unresolved. The land beneath the estate was no longer perfectly stable. Every year the palace required more attention. More maintenance. More financial investment. It had become a masterpiece that demanded constant care simply to survive. But aristocratic pride made it difficult to admit the truth. Hamilton Palace was beginning to feel less like a triumph, and more like a burden. The final golden years. Despite these concerns, the early years of the 20th century still brought moments of dazzling elegance to the palace. Formal gatherings continued. Important guests arrived from London and across Europe. The Hamilton art collection remained one of the most admired in Britain. Visitors walked through the long gallery in awe. They admired paintings that would today be worth millions. They admired furniture crafted centuries earlier for royal courts. And they admired the architecture itself. Few buildings could rival the sheer scale of Hamilton Palace. To outsiders, it still appeared indestructible. Yet beneath the marble floors and towering columns, the silent movement of the earth continued. Slow, invisible, but relentless. A dynasty at a crossroads. By the early 20th century, the Hamilton family faced a difficult reality. The palace was becoming too expensive. The structural concerns were growing. And maintaining the enormous estate required financial resources that were increasingly difficult to secure. Some advisors suggested scaling back operations. Others recommended selling portions of the estate. But the idea of abandoning Hamilton Palace was almost unimaginable. This was not merely a house. It was the symbol of an entire dynasty. Generations of Hamilton dukes had lived within its walls. The palace represented centuries of aristocratic history. To give it up would feel like surrendering the family legacy itself. And so the Hamiltons continued trying to preserve their grand residence. But time was no longer on their side. The gathering storm. As Europe moved toward a new and uncertain century, the pressures facing the Hamilton family intensified. Economic changes, structural risks, and a palace that demanded more resources every year. The once glorious monument of aristocratic power had begun showing undeniable signs of vulnerability. But the greatest challenges were still ahead. Because the 20th century would bring events far more disruptive than shifting ground or rising maintenance costs. Events that would reshape Britain itself. Wars, economic upheaval, and social transformations that would challenge the very existence of aristocratic dynasties. For Hamilton Palace, these forces would prove devastating. And within just a few decades, the unthinkable question would become impossible to ignore. Could the greatest private palace in Britain survive the modern world? Or would the magnificent halls of Hamilton Palace fall silent forever? In the early years of the 20th century, the towering facade of Hamilton Palace still projected an image of unshakable aristocratic power. The massive columns stood silent beneath the often clouded skies of Hamilton. Visitors who arrived at the estate could still experience the same overwhelming sensation that generations before them had felt. The palace seemed eternal. Its stone walls appeared too thick, too vast, too grand to ever truly disappear. Inside, the Hamilton dynasty continued to maintain the traditions that had defined them for centuries. Formal dinners, grand receptions, quiet walks through the long gallery, surrounded by paintings collected from across Europe. But beyond the palace gates, the world was beginning to change in ways that few aristocratic families had anticipated. And those changes would soon place extraordinary pressure on estates like Hamilton Palace. Because the age of unquestioned aristocratic dominance was slowly fading. And the new century was not kind to monuments of old wealth. A world on the edge of change. The early 1900s marked a period of profound transformation throughout Britain. Industrial cities were expanding rapidly. Railways connected distant regions with unprecedented speed. A new class of industrial entrepreneurs was rising to prominence. These individuals had built their fortunes not through inherited land, but through innovation, manufacturing, and global trade. Meanwhile, the traditional aristocracy, families like the Hamiltons, still relied heavily on land-based income. Agriculture, estate rents, mining operations. For generations, this system had sustained vast properties and lavish lifestyles. But the economic balance was shifting. Taxes on large estates began increasing. Maintenance costs climbed steadily. And many aristocratic families discovered that their enormous properties were becoming increasingly difficult to support. For Hamilton Palace, the challenge was even greater. Because the palace was not simply large. It was one of the largest private residences ever built in Britain. The weight of an enormous estate. Maintaining Hamilton Palace required extraordinary resources. The building itself stretched across immense dimensions. Heating the great halls during Scotland's cold winters consumed massive amounts of coal. Servants were needed in large numbers simply to maintain daily operations. The gardens alone required constant care. And the priceless art collection within the palace demanded professional attention to ensure its preservation. Every painting, every sculpture, every antique piece of furniture required careful monitoring. The cost of maintaining such luxury had once been manageable. But by the early 20th century, those costs were rising faster than estate revenues. And then, history introduced an even greater disruption. A global conflict that would reshape Britain forever. The shock of war. In 1914, Europe descended into chaos with the outbreak of the World War I. For aristocratic families across Britain, the war brought immediate changes. Young men from noble households joined military service. Estate workers enlisted in large numbers. Agricultural production was redirected to support the war effort. And the financial structure of the country shifted dramatically. Taxes increased to support wartime expenses. Inflation rose. Economic stability became uncertain. For estates like Hamilton Palace, these pressures were particularly severe. Income from traditional sources declined. Meanwhile, the palace still required enormous resources to maintain. And the structural concerns, caused by mining activity beneath the estate, had not disappeared. In fact, they were becoming more difficult to ignore. A palace under strain. Throughout the war years, Hamilton Palace remained standing. Its halls were quieter. Its gatherings less extravagant. But the building still symbolized centuries of aristocratic prestige. However, beneath the surface the strain was growing. The land beneath the estate continued shifting slowly due to nearby mining operations. Engineers had already warned that these underground cavities could destabilize sections of the palace. And now, with wartime financial pressures mounting, expensive structural repairs became harder to justify. Small cracks continued appearing in walls and ceilings. Certain areas of the palace required constant reinforcement. The situation was not catastrophic, but it was persistent. And the palace's sheer scale meant that even minor issues required substantial effort to manage. Still, the Hamilton family remained determined to preserve their ancestral home. Abandoning the palace seemed unimaginable, at least for the moment. The end of an era. When World War I ended in 1918, Britain emerged profoundly changed. The economic and social landscape was no longer the same. The war had accelerated transformations that were already underway. Large aristocratic estates across the country faced severe financial strain. Many families were forced to sell land, artwork, or even entire residences. Palaces that had once symbolized absolute power now appeared increasingly impractical in the modern world. Hamilton Palace, despite its legendary status, was not immune to these pressures. The estate still generated income. But the balance between revenue and expense had shifted dramatically. The palace demanded more resources than ever before. And the Hamilton dynasty was beginning to face difficult questions. How long could they continue maintaining such an enormous residence? And what would happen if they couldn't? The priceless collection. Inside Hamilton Palace remained one of the most valuable private art collections in Britain. The galleries held masterpieces accumulated over generations. Paintings attributed to renowned European artists. Rare sculptures from classical antiquity. Furniture crafted for royal courts centuries earlier. This collection alone represented extraordinary cultural and financial value. Yet its presence also created a dilemma. The art collection was deeply tied to the identity of the Hamilton family. But it also represented a potential solution to their growing financial concerns. Selling even a portion of the collection could generate enormous funds. Funds that might help preserve the palace itself. But selling such treasures would be controversial. It would signal that the Hamilton dynasty was no longer financially invincible. And aristocratic pride made such admissions extremely difficult. Still, the pressure was mounting. And soon, the Hamilton family would face a decision that shocked the British public. The structural problem returns. At the same time, the structural stability of the palace continued to deteriorate slowly. Mining beneath nearby land had caused subtle but measurable ground movement. Engineers monitored the situation carefully. Some believed the palace could survive with continued reinforcement. Others warned that the problem might worsen over time. The uncertainty created a growing sense of unease. Hamilton Palace had been built as a monument to permanence. But permanence requires stable ground. And the earth beneath the estate was no longer entirely predictable. Repairing the palace required enormous investment. Ignoring the problem carried significant risk. And the Hamilton family found themselves trapped between pride, tradition, and practical reality. The gathering financial storm. By the 1920s, the financial pressure facing the Hamilton estate had reached a critical stage. Maintenance costs remained enormous. Income sources fluctuated. Taxes continued rising. And the palace itself required ongoing structural attention. Advisors began quietly discussing drastic options. Selling portions of land. Reducing staff. Or even parting with elements of the famous art collection. Each suggestion carried consequences. But one thing was becoming increasingly clear. The world that had created Hamilton Palace no longer existed. The economic environment that once supported such extravagant estates had changed, and adapting to that new reality would require decisions that previous generations of Hamilton dukes would never have imagined. The decision that shocked Britain. Eventually, the pressure became impossible to ignore. The Hamilton family began preparing for a step that would send shockwaves through aristocratic society. They would begin selling parts of their legendary art collection, paintings, furniture, artifacts that had been displayed within Hamilton Palace for generations. Each sale would provide temporary financial relief, but it would also slowly dismantle one of Britain's most extraordinary private collections. The palace that had once functioned like a grand museum would begin losing the treasures that defined its identity. Visitors who once wandered through galleries filled with masterpieces would soon notice empty spaces on the walls. And for the first time in its history, Hamilton Palace would appear vulnerable. The beginning of the end. To outsiders, the palace still appeared magnificent. Its towering columns still dominated the landscape. Its architecture still inspired awe. But inside the Hamilton dynasty, a quiet realization was forming. Preserving Hamilton Palace exactly as it had existed in the 19th century might no longer be possible. The palace had been built during an age of limitless aristocratic confidence. But the 20th century had introduced a harsher reality: economic pressure, structural instability, and a changing society that no longer revolved around aristocratic power. Hamilton Palace had survived wars, political shifts, and centuries of history. Yet the greatest threat it faced was something far less dramatic: time, and the enormous cost of maintaining greatness. And soon, the Hamilton family would confront the most painful question of all. Not how to preserve the palace, but whether it could be preserved at all. For generations, the vast halls of Hamilton Palace had been filled with objects that represented the cultural power of an aristocratic dynasty. Paintings from Renaissance masters, rare sculptures from ancient civilizations, furniture that had once stood in the chambers of European royalty. Visitors walking through the palace often felt they were inside something more than a residence. It felt like a private museum of European history. But by the early 20th century, the Hamilton family faced a painful reality. The palace that had once symbolized their dominance had become almost impossible to maintain. Cost had spiraled. Estate income had weakened. And structural concerns caused by nearby mining activity still lingered beneath the grounds of Hamilton. For decades, the Hamilton dynasty had projected an image of absolute wealth. Now they were forced to confront something they had rarely faced before: financial limits. And the solution they chose would shock Britain. The decision no duke wanted to make. The Hamilton art collection had taken generations to assemble. Each duke had added new masterpieces. Each acquisition strengthened the family's reputation as one of Britain's greatest cultural patrons. But that same collection had now become their most valuable financial asset. Selling parts of it could bring enormous sums of money. Enough to stabilize the estate. Enough, perhaps, to save Hamilton Palace itself. But the emotional cost was immense. These artworks were not merely investments. They were symbols of legacy, family identity, and centuries of aristocratic prestige. Yet as financial pressures grew, the choice became unavoidable. The Hamilton family would begin selling pieces from their legendary collection. And the sale would become one of the most famous aristocratic auctions in British history. The auction that captured public attention. In the late 1910s and early 1920s, announcements began circulating through Britain's art world. Pieces from the Hamilton collection would be offered to buyers. Collectors across Europe and America took immediate notice. The reputation of the collection was extraordinary. Many of the artworks had rarely been displayed outside the palace. Some had been hidden within private galleries for generations. Now they were about to enter the global market. Dealers, museums, private collectors, all prepared to compete for the treasures of Hamilton Palace. The news spread quickly through British society. For many observers, the auction symbolized something larger than the sale of artwork. It represented a shift in power. A sign that even the grandest aristocratic families were no longer immune to financial pressure. Priceless treasures leave the palace. One by one, the treasures of Hamilton Palace began leaving the galleries where they had hung for decades. Paintings that had once dominated the walls of the Long Gallery were carefully packed and transported to auction houses. Rare sculptures were catalogued and photographed. Antique furniture, crafted by master artisans centuries earlier, was removed from the palace rooms where it had once stood proudly. Each object carried a story. Each item represented a moment in the Hamilton family's long history of collecting. And now those stories were being scattered across the world. Museums acquired some pieces. Wealthy collectors purchased others. Gradually, the once legendary Hamilton collection began dissolving. Visitors returning to the palace noticed something strange. The galleries were still magnificent, but gaps had begun appearing. Empty spaces on the walls. Rooms that felt quieter than before. It was the first visible sign that the Hamilton Empire was changing. A blow to aristocratic prestige. Within Britain's aristocratic circles, the sale of the Hamilton collection created a mixture of fascination and unease. Some families privately sympathized. They understood the financial pressures facing large estates. But others saw the auction as something more troubling. If the Hamilton dynasty, one of the most powerful aristocratic families in Scotland, was forced to sell its treasures, what did that mean for everyone else? The sale symbolized the fragility of old wealth in the modern era. The world was no longer structured in the same way it had been during the 18th and 19th centuries. Industrial fortunes were rising. Global markets were reshaping economics. And aristocratic estates built on land income were finding it increasingly difficult to compete. Hamilton Palace had once represented the pinnacle of aristocratic luxury. Now it represented something else. The vulnerability of tradition in a rapidly changing world. Temporary relief. Financially, the auctions provided temporary relief. The sale of even a few masterpieces generated enormous sums. For a time, it seemed possible that the Hamilton estate might stabilize. Repairs to the palace continued. Structural reinforcements were made where necessary. Staff levels were adjusted. Expenses were carefully reviewed. The Hamilton family hoped that these measures would allow the palace to survive the difficult economic climate of the early 20th century. But beneath the surface, deeper problems remained. The palace itself was still extraordinarily expensive to maintain. And the structural issues caused by underground mining had not completely disappeared. Even with new funds from art sales, the palace required constant attention. It was a financial giant that demanded endless resources. And those resources were becoming harder to secure. A palace slowly emptying. As the years passed, more objects quietly disappeared from Hamilton Palace. Not all sales were public auctions. Some pieces were sold privately. Others were transferred to institutions where they would be preserved for future generations. Gradually, the palace lost the atmosphere that had once made it legendary. The Long Gallery still existed. But its walls no longer displayed the same breathtaking collection. Some rooms were closed entirely. Others were used less frequently. The palace had not yet lost its grandeur. But it had lost part of its soul. For the Hamilton family, this transformation was deeply painful. Every sale represented another piece of their legacy leaving the estate. Yet without those sales, maintaining the palace would have been impossible. It was a difficult balance. Preserve the palace, or preserve the collection that had defined it. In many ways, both were slowly slipping away. The structural threat returns. While financial struggles dominated headlines, another threat continued quietly in the background. The land beneath the Hamilton estate remained unstable. Coal mining operations in the region had created underground cavities that affected the surrounding landscape. Engineers continued monitoring the palace structure. They reinforced walls, strengthened foundations, and carefully observed signs of ground movement. But the truth was unsettling. No amount of repair could fully eliminate the long-term risks created by mining beneath nearby land. The palace had been built during an era when such industrial activity was not fully understood. Now the consequences were becoming increasingly clear. The ground beneath the estate was no longer perfectly stable. And the enormous weight of Hamilton Palace made it particularly vulnerable. A symbol of a changing Britain. By the late 1920s, Hamilton Palace stood as a strange symbol of two different eras. From the outside, it still represented the grandeur of Britain's aristocratic past. The massive columns, the sweeping facade, the endless corridors, all remained impressive. But inside, the palace had changed. The art collection that once defined it was shrinking. Certain rooms were rarely used. And the cost of maintaining the enormous building continued rising. Across Britain, other aristocratic estates faced similar challenges. Some were converted into schools. Others were sold to institutions. A few were abandoned entirely. The age of enormous private palaces was quietly fading. Hamilton Palace was simply one of the most dramatic examples of that transformation. A dynasty running out of time. Despite their efforts, the Hamilton family could not fully escape the pressures surrounding them. Financial stability remained fragile. Structural concerns persisted, and the palace itself continued demanding enormous resources. Each year brought new questions. Could the estate survive another decade? Could the palace remain occupied indefinitely? Or would the Hamilton dynasty eventually be forced to consider a possibility that once seemed impossible? Leaving Hamilton Palace behind. For centuries, the building had been the heart of the Hamilton legacy. It was the physical symbol of their power, wealth, and influence. To abandon it would mean closing a chapter that had defined generations. But history was moving quickly, and the 20th century had little patience for monuments built during a very different age. The silence begins. As the 1930s approached, something unusual began happening at Hamilton Palace. The grand gatherings that once filled its halls became increasingly rare. The vast rooms that had hosted aristocrats, diplomats, and royalty grew quieter. Servants still maintained the building, but fewer guests arrived. The palace was still standing, still magnificent, but its era of constant celebration had passed. The Hamilton dynasty had done everything possible to preserve their ancestral home. Yet the combination of financial strain, structural instability, and changing social realities continued tightening around them. Soon, a decision would be made that shocked Britain once again. A decision not about selling art, but about the palace itself. And when that moment arrived, it would mark the beginning of the final chapter in the story of Hamilton Palace. For more than a century, the towering facade of Hamilton Palace had stood as a symbol of aristocratic supremacy. Visitors arriving in Hamilton could see it from miles away. A monumental structure of stone and symmetry. Colossal columns rising against the gray Scottish sky. Endless windows reflecting the landscape of the vast Hamilton estate. To generations of observers, the palace seemed immovable. A fortress of wealth. A monument to the confidence of the Duke of Hamilton. But by the early 20th century, the truth had become impossible to ignore. The palace was no longer entirely stable. The ground beneath it was slowly shifting. And the building that once symbolized permanence was beginning to feel fragile. The earth beneath the palace. The cause of the palace's growing danger lay far below its marble floors. Coal mining operations had expanded across the region for decades. The Hamilton estate itself had benefited financially from these mines. Coal had powered Britain's factories, railways, and cities during the Industrial Revolution. And for years, the mining income helped support the enormous cost of maintaining the palace. But mining has consequences. As coal was removed from deep underground layers, empty chambers were left behind. Over time, these spaces caused subtle changes in the surrounding ground. Land that once rested on solid support began slowly shifting. This phenomenon, known as subsidence, was not unusual in mining regions. But Hamilton Palace faced a unique problem. It was enormous. Few buildings in Britain carried such weight across such a large footprint. When the ground beneath a building moves even slightly, cracks can appear. When the building weighs thousands of tons, those cracks become much more serious. Engineers deliver unsettling news. By the 1920s and early 1930s, structural engineers had become increasingly concerned about the condition of the palace. They conducted detailed inspections. They studied foundation stability. They monitored small changes in walls and ceilings. What they found was troubling. Certain sections of the palace had shifted measurably. Columns required reinforcement. Stone blocks weighing several tons had subtly moved from their original positions. Cracks had expanded in some interior walls. Individually, none of these issues meant immediate disaster. But collectively they told a worrying story. Hamilton Palace was slowly being affected by the unstable ground beneath it. The building was not collapsing. But it was no longer behaving like a structure resting on completely stable land. For a palace built on such an enormous scale, that uncertainty was dangerous. A building too big to fix. Repairing structural damage in a normal house might be manageable. Repairing a palace like Hamilton was something entirely different. The building was massive. Hundreds of rooms. Vast halls with towering ceilings. Long corridors stretching across multiple wings. Every repair required careful engineering and enormous expense. Reinforcing the foundations of such a structure was not a simple task. In fact, engineers warned that fully stabilizing the palace might require work so extensive that it could become financially impossible. And even if those repairs were completed, the underground mining activity in the region meant the land could continue shifting in the future. In other words, the palace might never be completely secure again. This realization changed everything. Hamilton Palace was no longer just expensive. It was potentially unsafe. A quiet fear inside the palace. Within the Hamilton family, the growing structural concerns created a sense of quiet anxiety. For generations, the palace had been the heart of their dynasty. Every duke had lived there. Every family celebration had taken place within its grand halls. But now, the possibility existed that the palace might not remain a safe residence indefinitely. Some rooms were already showing signs of structural stress. Engineers recommended limiting access to certain areas. Heavy architectural features, such as large stone cornices, required careful monitoring. These precautions were subtle. Visitors might not notice them. But for the Hamilton family, they were deeply unsettling. The palace that once symbolized strength was now something that required constant supervision. The last years of occupation. By the early 1920s, the Hamilton family had already begun spending less time inside the palace. Part of this shift was financial. The building had become extremely expensive to maintain. But structural concerns also played a role. Living inside such a vast structure no longer felt entirely comfortable. Gradually, the family began using other residences more frequently. Hamilton Palace was still maintained. Servants continued caring for the building. But its role as the primary family residence was slowly fading. The palace had entered a strange new phase. It still existed. It was still magnificent. But it was no longer the vibrant center of aristocratic life it had once been. The great halls were quieter now. And silence inside a building that large can feel unsettling. The public begins to notice. As news of the palace's structural concerns circulated, public curiosity grew. For decades, Hamilton Palace had been famous across Britain. Many people considered it one of the most impressive private residences ever constructed. The idea that such a monumental structure might face serious problems felt almost unbelievable. Newspapers occasionally reported on the situation. Engineers discussed the effects of mining subsidence in the region. And gradually, a realization spread. Even the grandest symbols of aristocratic wealth were not immune to the consequences of industrial change. Hamilton Palace had been built during an era of supreme aristocratic confidence. But the industrial world that helped finance its existence had also created the conditions that now threatened it. It was an irony that few could ignore. The cost of preservation. By the 1930s, the Hamilton family faced an increasingly difficult calculation. Preserving the palace would require massive investment, structural reinforcements, continuous monitoring, and ongoing maintenance for a building of extraordinary size. At the same time, the estate's financial resources were no longer what they once had been. The sale of artwork had helped temporarily, but those funds were not limitless, and the palace itself continued demanding enormous attention. The question became unavoidable. Was it worth preserving a building that might never be completely stable again? For the Hamilton dynasty, this question carried emotional weight far beyond simple economics. Hamilton Palace represented centuries of history. But preserving history sometimes requires painful decisions. A palace without a purpose. Another issue quietly emerged during this period. Even if the palace could be stabilized, what purpose would it serve? By the mid-20th century, aristocratic life had changed dramatically. Few families continued living in residences of such enormous scale. The world that had created Hamilton Palace, an era of vast estates and large household staffs, was fading. Maintaining hundreds of rooms simply for tradition's sake no longer made practical sense. Some suggested converting the palace into a public attraction. Others proposed turning it into an institutional building. But the structural risks made such plans difficult. Every potential solution encountered the same obstacle. The palace was simply too large, too expensive, and too unstable. The inevitable question. Eventually, the Hamilton family confronted the possibility they had long avoided. What if the palace could not be saved? What if the most practical decision was not preservation, but removal? The idea seemed almost unimaginable. Hamilton Palace was one of the grandest residences ever built in Britain. Its architecture had inspired awe for more than a century. Yet the combination of structural danger and financial pressure was pushing the family toward a conclusion few aristocrats ever wanted to face. The palace might need to disappear. The beginning of the end. As the late 1930s approached, discussions about the future of Hamilton Palace intensified. Engineers continued monitoring the structure. Financial advisors studied the costs of ongoing maintenance. And the Hamilton family weighed the emotional burden of their choices. For generations, the palace had represented the power of their dynasty. But power can fade. And sometimes, even the most magnificent monuments must surrender to the realities of time. Soon, a decision would be made that would shock Britain. Not another art sale. Not another structural repair. But something far more dramatic. A decision that would erase one of the greatest private palaces ever built, and transform the Hamilton estate forever. For more than a century, Hamilton Palace had dominated the Scottish landscape with quiet authority. Its massive facade rose above the surrounding lands of Hamilton, projecting the kind of confidence only centuries of aristocratic wealth could create. To those who visited, the palace felt almost indestructible. Colossal Corinthian columns guarded its entrance. Great halls stretched into the distance. Rooms filled with art and history whispered the story of a dynasty that had shaped Scottish society for generations. For the Hamilton family, holders of the powerful title Duke of Hamilton, the palace was far more than architecture. It was identity, legacy, proof that their influence had endured across centuries. But by the late 1920s and early 1930s, a troubling reality had taken hold. Hamilton Palace was no longer just a symbol of prestige. It had become a problem that no amount of pride could solve. And the question now facing the Hamilton family was almost unthinkable. What happens when a palace becomes too dangerous to keep? The palace no one could save. Engineers had studied the structure for years. Their reports were consistent. The land beneath the estate had been altered by decades of coal mining. Underground cavities created subtle but constant shifts in the earth. For smaller buildings, these shifts might have been manageable. But Hamilton Palace was not small. It was one of the largest private residences ever built in Britain. Its vast stone structure weighed thousands of tons. And that weight required perfectly stable ground. The problem was simple and deeply unsettling. The ground was no longer perfectly stable. Each year brought new cracks, new signs of structural movement, new repairs that grew more expensive and more complicated. And despite every effort, engineers could not guarantee that the palace would remain secure in the long term. The building had become unpredictable. For a residence of such scale, unpredictability was dangerous. Pride versus reality. For the Hamilton dynasty, the idea of losing their ancestral palace was emotionally devastating. Hamilton Palace had been the family's central residence since the early 19th century. Generations of dukes had walked its corridors. Celebrations, political meetings, and historic gatherings had all taken place within its walls. The palace had been designed to endure forever. To abandon it felt like surrendering the physical embodiment of the Hamilton legacy. But reality had begun to outweigh tradition. The palace required constant repairs. Maintenance costs remained enormous. And structural concerns continued growing. Preserving the building would demand extraordinary investment, with no guarantee of success. The Hamilton family faced a decision that few aristocrats had ever confronted. Whether to continue fighting for a building that might never be safe again, or accept that its time had come to an end. A shocking proposal. At first, the idea was whispered quietly among advisors. It seemed almost impossible to say out loud. If Hamilton Palace could not be stabilized, if its maintenance continued draining the estate's resources, then perhaps the most practical solution was also the most drastic. The palace might need to be dismantled, demolished, removed entirely from the landscape where it had stood for more than a century. Even discussing such a possibility felt shocking. Hamilton Palace was not just another aristocratic home. It was one of the most famous private palaces in Britain. Its architecture had been admired by visitors from across Europe. Destroying it would mean erasing a major symbol of Scotland's aristocratic past. But engineers were clear. Keeping the palace standing indefinitely might not be safe. And the costs of maintaining it would only continue increasing. The proposal that once seemed impossible slowly began to feel unavoidable. The final deliberations. Inside the Hamilton family, discussions about the palace became deeply emotional. Some believed the building must be preserved at any cost. Others recognized the practical realities. The estate's financial resources were not unlimited. The structural problems were real. And the world had changed dramatically since the palace was built. Large aristocratic residences were becoming increasingly rare. Across Britain, many great houses were being sold, converted, or abandoned. The age of enormous private palaces was fading. Hamilton Palace simply represented the most dramatic example of that change. Eventually, the Hamilton family reached a painful conclusion. Preserving the palace was no longer practical. And so, one of Britain's greatest aristocratic monuments was quietly marked for destruction. Britain reacts. When news of the decision began circulating, it shocked observers across the country. Hamilton Palace had been considered a landmark of aristocratic architecture. For many people, the idea that such a magnificent structure would be deliberately demolished seemed almost unbelievable. Newspapers reported on the situation with fascination. Historians and architects expressed deep regret. Some critics argued that the palace should be preserved as a historic monument. Others understood the financial and structural realities facing the Hamilton estate. But regardless of opinion, one thing was clear. The demolition of Hamilton Palace would mark the end of an era, the disappearance of one of Britain's greatest private residences, and the symbolic collapse of a world that had once seemed permanent. The palace begins to empty. Before demolition could begin, the palace itself had to be emptied. The rooms that had once held priceless artworks were already partially vacant due to earlier auctions. Now the remaining contents were carefully removed. Furniture, decorations, architectural elements. Anything that could be preserved was taken away. Some pieces were sold. Others were transferred to museums or private collections. Gradually, the palace's vast halls lost the final traces of their former life. The long gallery, once filled with masterpieces, stood nearly bare. The grand dining hall, once alive with conversation and candlelight, fell silent. Servants who had spent their lives working within the palace watched as the rooms slowly emptied. It was not simply the end of a building. It was the closing of an entire chapter of history. The last walk through the palace. For members of the Hamilton family, walking through the palace during those final days must have felt surreal. Every room held memories. Every corridor echoed with the footsteps of generations past. The building still stood proudly. Its architecture remained magnificent. Yet everyone knew that its days were numbered. Soon the great halls would vanish. Soon the towering columns would disappear. Soon the palace that had defined the Hamilton dynasty would exist only in photographs and memory. And perhaps the most haunting part of that realization was this. Hamilton Palace had not been destroyed by war. It had not fallen to fire. It had not been abandoned through sudden tragedy. Instead, it was being dismantled deliberately, because the world that created it had quietly vanished. A monument to a lost era. By the early 20th century, aristocratic Britain had entered a period of transformation. The economic systems that once supported enormous estates were disappearing. Industrial wealth had replaced land-based fortunes. Social attitudes were shifting. And maintaining giant private palaces no longer made practical sense. Hamilton Palace had been built during a time of limitless aristocratic confidence. A time when wealth seemed permanent. When dynasties believed their power would last forever. But history rarely allows such permanence. And Hamilton Palace was about to become one of the most dramatic examples of that truth. The machines arrived. Soon, preparations began for the final stage. The dismantling of Hamilton Palace itself. Workers arrived at the estate. Equipment was brought in. Plans were drawn for carefully taking apart the enormous structure. For a building that had once symbolized supreme aristocratic confidence, the end would come not through sudden disaster, but through a slow and deliberate process. Stone by stone, wall by wall, the palace would disappear. And with it, one of the most extraordinary chapters in British architectural history. But even as demolition approached, many wondered something strange. If Hamilton Palace was about to vanish, what would remain? Would anything survive of the magnificent residence that once dominated Scotland's landscape? Or would the greatest private palace in Britain simply fade into history? For more than 100 years, the immense structure of Hamilton Palace had dominated the landscape around Hamilton. Its colossal columns stood like silent guardians of a vanished age. The palace had been built not merely as a residence, but as a declaration of power by the family who held the ancient title of Duke of Hamilton. For generations, its halls had echoed with aristocratic conversation, diplomatic visits, and the quiet footsteps of hundreds of servants maintaining one of the largest private homes in Britain. Now those same halls were empty. The paintings had been removed. The furniture had vanished. The great chandeliers that once illuminated lavish dinners were gone. What remained was the skeleton of a palace, still majestic, still enormous, but waiting for its final fate. Because the decision had already been made. Hamilton Palace would not survive the 20th century. And soon, the dismantling of one of Britain's most extraordinary residences would begin. The beginning of the end. The demolition process began quietly in the 1920s. Unlike the dramatic destruction of buildings during wartime or natural disasters, the end of Hamilton Palace was slow and deliberate. Every stage had to be carefully planned. The structure was simply too large to destroy quickly. Massive stone walls, Heavy columns. Vast foundations that had been designed to support thousands of tons of stone. Workers approached the task methodically. Scaffolding rose around the outer walls. Tools and equipment were brought into the empty courtyards. And one section at a time, the palace began to come apart. For those who witnessed the process, it was almost surreal. A building that had once symbolized aristocratic permanence was slowly being reduced to fragments. Salvaging the palace. Before large sections of the palace could be dismantled, valuable architectural elements were carefully removed. Stone carvings, decorative moldings, grand fireplaces. Anything that could be preserved or reused was taken away. Some pieces were sold to collectors. Others were incorporated into different buildings across Britain. In this way, fragments of Hamilton Palace quietly survived, even as the structure itself disappeared. Massive blocks of stone were transported away by carts and trucks. Some of these materials were reused in local construction projects. Others vanished into private collections, where they would remain silent reminders of the palace that once stood in Scotland. But no matter how many pieces were preserved, the palace itself could not be saved. Its enormous size made full preservation impossible. And the unstable ground beneath the estate meant rebuilding or repurposing the structure was never truly practical. The fall of the great columns. Perhaps the most dramatic moment in the demolition came when workers began dismantling the palace's famous columns. These towering Corinthian pillars had once been the defining architectural feature of the building. Visitors approaching the palace could see them from a great distance. They created an entrance that resembled a Roman temple, an intentional design meant to convey authority and grandeur. Now those same columns were carefully taken apart. Stone sections were lowered piece by piece. Massive blocks that had once stood proudly at the palace entrance were carried away. For locals who had grown up seeing the palace dominate the skyline, the sight was astonishing. Each removed column changed the silhouette of the building. Each disappearing section made the palace feel smaller, less permanent, less powerful. Gradually, the architectural icon that had once defined the region began losing its familiar shape. A landscape transformed. As the demolition continued through the late 1920s, the surrounding landscape began to change. For decades, Hamilton Palace had been the focal point of the estate. The building's enormous scale meant that it defined the visual identity of the entire area. Now, as sections disappeared, the skyline looked unfamiliar. Walls that had once stretched across the horizon were gone. Grand halls were reduced to rubble. The palace that had once symbolized aristocratic authority was slowly fading into the earth. Locals who passed the estate often paused to observe the transformation. Some watched with curiosity. Others felt a sense of melancholy. After all, Hamilton Palace had been part of the region's identity for generations. Its disappearance felt like the closing of an era. The last walls. By the early 1930s, much of the palace had already been dismantled. The grand interior rooms no longer existed. The galleries that once displayed priceless art were empty spaces exposed to the sky. Workers continued removing stone sections methodically. The process was slow but inevitable. Every day the structure became smaller, less recognizable, less imposing. Eventually, only fragments of the once enormous building remained. Sections of foundation, partial walls, scattered stones marking where vast halls had once stood. The palace that had once rivaled royal residences had been reduced to little more than an outline in the landscape. A palace reduced to memory. For the Hamilton family, witnessing the disappearance of their ancestral residence must have been deeply emotional. Generations of dukes had built their lives around the palace. It had hosted celebrations, negotiations, and gatherings that shaped Scottish society. Now it existed only in memory. Photographs preserved its appearance. Paintings captured its grandeur. But the building itself was gone. Where the palace once stood, open land slowly replaced the enormous structure. Nature began reclaiming the space. Grass-covered areas where marble floors had once reflected candlelight. Trees grew where grand corridors had stretched across the estate. It was as though the land itself was quietly erasing the palace from existence. Britain's greatest lost palace. Historians would later describe Hamilton Palace as one of the most extraordinary residences ever built in Britain. Its scale had been remarkable. Its art collection legendary. Its architecture among the most impressive examples of aristocratic design in Scotland. And yet, within just a few decades, it had vanished almost completely. Unlike many historic buildings that survive through preservation efforts, Hamilton Palace had disappeared almost entirely. The reasons were complex. structural instability, financial pressure, changing social realities. Together, they created circumstances that made demolition seem unavoidable. And so, one of Britain's greatest private palaces passed into history. The empty grounds. Today, visitors to the site where Hamilton Palace once stood might struggle to imagine the enormous building that once occupied the land. Only subtle traces remain. Fragments of foundation, historical records, photographs preserved in archives. Without those records, the palace might have been forgotten entirely. The fields around Hamilton now appear quiet and ordinary. Yet beneath that calm landscape lies the memory of a structure that once symbolized the height of aristocratic ambition. A palace built to impress the world. And a palace that ultimately proved too grand to survive it. The echoes of grandeur. Even though Hamilton Palace no longer exists, its story continues to captivate historians and visitors alike. It represents more than just architecture. It symbolizes an entire era of British history. A time when aristocratic families expressed power through enormous residences. When art collections were assembled as symbols of cultural influence. And when wealth seemed capable of building monuments that would last forever. Hamilton Palace proved something different. Even the grandest monuments can disappear. Even the most powerful dynasties must eventually adapt to changing times. And sometimes, the buildings that once symbolized supremacy become reminders of how quickly power can fade. A mystery of legacy. Yet the story of Hamilton Palace does not end with its demolition. Because something unusual happened after the palace vanished. Its legacy did not disappear with the stone walls. Fragments of its art collection still exist across the world. Architectural pieces remain scattered in other buildings. And historians continue studying the remarkable rise and fall of the Hamilton dynasty. In many ways, the palace became even more famous after it was gone. People began asking questions. What had life truly been like inside those massive halls? What decisions led to its downfall? And what lessons does the story of Hamilton Palace hold about wealth, power, and ambition? The answers to those questions would turn the vanished palace into something even more fascinating than before. A legend, a warning, and a reminder that even the greatest empires can disappear. Today, if someone travels to the quiet outskirts of Hamilton, they will find something surprising. There is no towering facade, no enormous staircase, no glittering halls stretching across the landscape. Where Hamilton Palace once stood, the land appears calm and almost ordinary. Grass covers the ground. Trees sway gently in the wind. And the skyline is completely different from what visitors would have seen just a century ago. Yet beneath this peaceful surface lies the story of one of the most extraordinary aristocratic residences ever built in Britain. A palace so vast that travelers compared it to royal estates. A palace filled with masterpieces and treasures from across Europe. A palace that once symbolized the immense power of the family who held the title Duke of Hamilton. And a palace that vanished almost completely from the landscape. But even though the building disappeared, the story did not. The landscape that replaced a palace. When demolition ended in the early 20th century, the land where Hamilton Palace once stood slowly returned to nature. Without the enormous structure dominating the view, the estate looked strangely open. The massive footprint of the palace had once defined the entire landscape. Now it was gone. Grass covered the ground where marble floors had once reflected candlelight. Birds moved freely through areas that had once been filled with aristocratic guests and servants. And over time, the land began to erase the physical traces of the palace. Yet historians and archaeologists later confirmed something remarkable. Beneath the soil, fragments of the palace still remain. Foundation stones. Buried structural elements. Subtle outlines marking where grand halls once stretched across the estate. These hidden remnants serve as silent reminders that an architectural giant once stood there. A palace that became legend. The disappearance of Hamilton Palace created something unexpected. Instead of fading into obscurity, the palace became legendary. People were fascinated by the idea that such an enormous building had existed, and then vanished almost entirely. Historians began studying its design. Architectural experts analyzed photographs and drawings. Writers explored the rise and fall of the Hamilton dynasty. In many ways, the palace's destruction made its story even more compelling. A surviving building can be visited. Its details can be observed directly. But a vanished building invites imagination. And Hamilton Palace provided plenty of material for curiosity. Visitors often ask the same question. How could something so massive disappear so completely? The lost art collection. Even though the palace itself is gone, parts of its legacy continue to exist in unexpected places. The famous Hamilton art collection, once displayed throughout the palace galleries, was dispersed during the early 20th century. Some paintings entered major museums. Others were purchased by private collectors. Furniture crafted centuries earlier now exists in collections around the world. These objects once belonged to the vast cultural display inside Hamilton Palace. Today they are scattered across continents. Yet each piece carries a hidden connection to the palace where it once stood. When historians trace the origins of certain artworks or antique furniture, they sometimes arrive at the same remarkable conclusion. This piece once hung on the walls of Hamilton Palace. A palace that no longer exists. The influence on British architecture. Despite its disappearance, Hamilton Palace left a lasting mark on architectural history. The building had represented one of the most ambitious examples of aristocratic design in Britain. Its massive scale, its classical columns, its symmetrical facade inspired by ancient Roman architecture. All of these features reflected the tastes and ambitions of the aristocratic world that built it. Architectural historians often study Hamilton Palace as an example of how wealth and power influenced design during the 18th and 19th centuries. Palaces were not simply homes. They were statements. They communicated prestige, authority, cultural refinement. Hamilton Palace achieved that goal perhaps better than almost any other private residence in Britain. And even though it vanished, the architectural philosophy behind it continues influencing historic studies today. The dynasty that built it. The story of the palace is inseparable from the family that created it. The Hamilton dynasty had been one of Scotland's most powerful aristocratic families for centuries. Their title, Duke of Hamilton, carried enormous historical significance. Members of the family had played major roles in politics, military service, and cultural patronage. Hamilton Palace had been designed to reflect that power. Every column and corridor expressed the confidence of a dynasty that believed its influence would last indefinitely. Yet history proved otherwise. The economic transformations of the 20th century reshaped Britain's social structure. Land-based wealth declined. Industrial fortunes rose. And aristocratic estates across the country faced pressures their builders had never imagined. Hamilton Palace became one of the most dramatic casualties of that transformation. A symbol of changing times. The demolition of Hamilton Palace marked more than the loss of a building. It symbolized the end of a particular era in British history. For centuries, aristocratic families had expressed power through monumental architecture. Great houses, expansive estates, lavish collections of art and artifacts. But the modern world demanded different priorities. Maintaining enormous private palaces became increasingly impractical. Many estates were sold. Others were converted into institutions or tourist attractions. Hamilton Palace represented an extreme example of this transition. A structure so large, so expensive, and so structurally vulnerable that preservation was nearly impossible. And so it disappeared. Not because it lacked beauty, but because the world around it had changed. The curiosity that remains. Even today, the story of Hamilton Palace continues to attract interest from historians, writers, and curious travelers. People search old photographs to understand its scale. They study architectural drawings to imagine its interior. They read historical accounts describing the lavish gatherings that once filled its halls. For some, the palace represents the pinnacle of aristocratic grandeur. For others, it represents the dangers of excess. A reminder that wealth, no matter how vast, cannot always guarantee permanence. And that monuments built with supreme confidence may one day face unexpected realities. Hamilton Palace stands as one of the most striking examples of that lesson. The silent ground. Walking across the fields where the palace once stood can feel strangely powerful. The land appears ordinary. But knowing what once existed there changes the experience. Beneath the quiet surface lies the memory of grand halls and towering columns. Of chandeliers reflecting candlelight across marble floors. Of aristocratic gatherings that shaped Scottish society. The palace may be gone. But the imagination can still reconstruct it. The mind can still picture the enormous structure rising above the estate. And in that sense, Hamilton Palace has not disappeared completely. It survives in memory, in history, and in the questions people continue asking about it. A story that refuses to fade. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Hamilton Palace is how its story continues long after its destruction. Many historic buildings survive physically but slowly fade from public awareness. Hamilton Palace experienced the opposite. Its disappearance made it legendary. The idea that one of Britain's greatest private residences could vanish almost entirely captures the imagination. It forces people to consider the fragile nature of even the grandest achievements. And it raises a final question. If Hamilton Palace represented the peak of aristocratic ambition, what does its disappearance say about the true nature of power? The final chapter approaches. The rise and fall of Hamilton Palace tells a story far greater than architecture. It tells the story of wealth, ambition, pride, and the unstoppable forces of change that reshape societies. From its breathtaking construction to its quiet demolition, the palace mirrored the journey of the aristocratic world that created it. A world of immense confidence. A world of grand displays. A world that believed its monuments would last forever. But history has a way of reminding every generation of a simple truth. Nothing built by human hands is truly permanent. And in the final chapter of this story, we will explore the lasting legacy of Hamilton Palace, and the haunting lesson it leaves behind. Stand quietly on the open land near Hamilton, and it becomes difficult to imagine what once existed here. No towering columns greet the horizon. No endless rows of palace windows catch the fading afternoon light. No carriages roll across gravel paths toward a monumental entrance. Instead, the land appears calm, almost ordinary. Yet beneath this quiet ground once stood Hamilton Palace, a residence so vast and extravagant that visitors once believed it rivaled the palaces of kings. A structure built not merely to house a family, but to proclaim their power, their wealth, their absolute confidence in the future. For generations, the palace symbolized the prestige of the dynasty that carried the ancient title Duke of Hamilton. And yet today almost nothing remains. Just land, silence, and a story that continues to echo across history. The illusion of permanence. When Hamilton Palace was constructed in the early 19th century, it represented the peak of aristocratic ambition. The palace was not built modestly. It was designed to impress. Massive Corinthian columns created an entrance that resembled a Roman temple. Grand halls stretched through the structure like ceremonial avenues. Rooms were filled with priceless paintings, sculptures, and furniture gathered from across Europe. Every detail communicated the same message. This dynasty had wealth that would endure forever. The Hamilton family believed their influence would last indefinitely. After all, their power had already survived centuries. Their estates covered vast areas of Scotland. Their title carried deep historical significance. And their palace was one of the most impressive private residences ever built in Britain. But history rarely rewards the belief that power is permanent. When wealth becomes a burden. Hamilton Palace was built during a time when aristocratic wealth seemed limitless. Land ownership generated enormous income. Mining operations produced industrial profit. And the prestige of noble titles carried immense influence. But the same forces that created this wealth eventually began reshaping the world around it. Industrialization transformed economies. New fortunes emerged from factories, railways, and global trade. Taxes increased. Traditional land revenues declined. And maintaining enormous estates became increasingly difficult. Hamilton Palace, once a symbol of supreme prosperity, slowly became something else. A financial burden. A structure so large that preserving it required resources even the Hamilton dynasty struggled to maintain. The palace had been built as a monument to wealth. But monuments require constant care. And eventually, even immense fortunes face limits. The silent threat beneath the ground. Perhaps the most ironic element in the story of Hamilton Palace lies beneath the land where it once stood. Coal mining had played a major role in supporting the estate's finances. For years, the extraction of coal helped fund the lavish lifestyle associated with the palace. But those same mining operations created underground cavities. Over time, the land began to shift. Slowly. Quietly. Almost invisibly. The enormous weight of the palace made it particularly vulnerable to these subtle movements. Cracks appeared. Structural concerns grew. Engineers warned that the building might never remain fully stable again. The industry that once helped support the palace had unintentionally contributed to its downfall. It was a reminder that even the most carefully built systems can contain hidden weaknesses. The end of an aristocratic era. The 20th century brought dramatic changes to Britain. The old aristocratic order, built on land, titles, and tradition, began losing its dominance. New forms of wealth replaced old estates. Social structures shifted. And the role of massive private palaces in society became increasingly uncertain. Across the country, great houses were abandoned, repurposed, or sold. Hamilton Palace simply represented the most dramatic example of this transformation. Its demolition symbolized the closing of a chapter in British history, an era when aristocratic dynasties expressed their power through architecture of breathtaking scale, an era when families believed their monuments would stand forever. But the 20th century proved that permanence was an illusion. What remains today? Today, fragments of Hamilton Palace survive in unexpected places. Architectural pieces were reused in other buildings. Elements of the famous art collection now exist in museums and private galleries around the world. Historical photographs preserve images of the palace at its peak. These remnants form a scattered archive of a vanished masterpiece. They remind historians that Hamilton Palace was not merely an extravagant residence. It was a cultural institution, a center of artistic patronage, a place where generations of history unfolded. Yet none of those fragments fully capture the scale of what once existed. Only imagination can reconstruct the vast halls and towering columns that once dominated the estate. The warning hidden in stone. The story of Hamilton Palace offers something deeper than architectural history. It provides a lesson about power and ambition. The palace was built during a time when wealth appeared unstoppable. Its creators believed their influence would continue indefinitely. But every system of power exists within a larger world. Economic forces change. Industries rise and fall. Societies evolve. And structures built with supreme confidence can suddenly face realities their creators never anticipated. Hamilton Palace became a symbol of that truth. A reminder that even the grandest achievements must adapt, or disappear. The psychology of old money. There is something particularly fascinating about the mindset that created Hamilton Palace. Aristocratic dynasties often thought in centuries rather than decades. Their estates had survived wars, political upheaval, and generations of leadership. That long history created a sense of permanence, a belief that the family legacy was woven into the fabric of the nation itself. Hamilton Palace reflected that psychology. It was designed not just for the present generation, but for all future generations of the Hamilton dynasty. Every column, every corridor, every gallery assumed that the family would continue living there forever. But history rarely follows such predictable paths. And sometimes the greatest symbols of stability become reminders of how quickly circumstances can change. A palace that lives only in memory. Today, Hamilton Palace exists primarily through records and imagination. Old photographs show the monumental facade. Architectural drawings reveal the vast interior layout. Historical accounts describe the glittering social gatherings that once filled its halls. Through these fragments, the palace lives on as one of the most remarkable lost buildings in Britain. For historians and enthusiasts, it represents a mystery of scale. How could something so enormous vanish so completely? The answer lies not in a single event, but in a combination of forces. Economic change, structural instability, and the slow transformation of British society itself. Together, they erased one of the most extraordinary private residences ever constructed. The final reflection. Standing on the quiet land where Hamilton Palace once stood, it becomes impossible not to reflect on the nature of power. The palace was built with immense confidence. Its creators believed their wealth and influence would last forever. But history is filled with monuments to that same belief. Empires, dynasties, grand architectural masterpieces, all built with the expectation of permanence. And yet, time eventually transforms them all. Hamilton Palace reminds us that even the most magnificent achievements are temporary. That power is rarely as stable as it appears. And that sometimes the greatest legacy of a building is not its survival, but the story it leaves behind. The echo that remains. Today, the wind moves gently across the fields of Hamilton. Where marble floors once reflected candlelight, grass now grows quietly. Where aristocrats once gathered beneath glittering chandeliers, birds cross the open sky. The palace is gone, but its story continues to resonate. A story of ambition, of wealth, of pride, and of the fragile illusion that power, no matter how vast, can ever truly last forever. Hamilton Palace may have vanished from the landscape, but the lesson it leaves behind remains as monumental as the palace itself.